So, Margaret, welcome to the podcast. We're talking.
Welcome, you
Oh,
pressed.
wait, are you're usually here, aren't you?
Well, in a sense.
Do we even have a guest today?
Well, I'm not introducing this object. I think this is a
He's
vice
Mr.
of yours.
Dragon, and he's a character.
This is a problem.
Mr.
um,
Dragon,
I hate it so much.
he doesn't have any problems except he gets a little nervous around people. Hey, I'm Mr. Dragon. Is that your friend Margaret? Oh, yes, it is Margaret. What if she doesn't like me? Margaret's pretty nice usually. Hey, Margaret, do you want to introduce yourself to Mr. Dragon?
I refuse. I refuse to compromise with you on this. I do want to know, have you picked that up since that last video you made with it?
No.
Because that I think
Okay.
was your greatest hit.
I'll drop the bit. There were
I think that was your greatest video.
in the writer's room, there are a few discrepancies
Writer's
about
room.
how we should approach teaching social anxiety. And, the Muppet thing was kind of brute force, but I still wanted to give it a shot.
It's plastic. Does it count as a Muppet if it's plastic?
It's a hand puppet.
Why do you have it? Is my question.
Because I saw it and I had to have it.
You're like, did you ever see the movie Big Daddy with the like Sprouse twins was the little boy and Adam Sandler was like
Mm-hmm.
they had to go to court and the little kid was super shy and so he got him these like sunglasses and he's like, no one can see you when you have these sunglasses on. That's you with that little plastic weird drink.
Yeah, pretty much. I'm invincible when I have it.
So Preston, what's today's episode about? Because I
Today-
didn't read anything.
We're talking about social anxiety disorder and the male loneliness epidemic.
The loneliness epidemic.
Mhm.
You're like, that's what I said.
Yeah.
Yes, we are.
And I think this is something that gets a lot of attention in pop psych.
Yes.
And everyone, I think I've seen a lot of people feel really empowered to comment on loneliness, but it's more complicated than that. And then it's tough because this kind of falls, like many things, into the spectrum of normal human behavior. And there's a difference between having worry or normal nerves about meeting someone and then becoming totally disordered by how much you hate social interaction.
Right. Like when we first started making this podcast, I felt like it was very normal for you to be afraid of messing up when you met me.
No, you're like, I wasn't like worried at all how you felt about me when I was like looking at my phone while you're like telling me something on a podcast.
Yeah, you're like, I don't give a fuck
You'd
this time.
think I would
you.
give you like my undivided attention, but like honestly, I don't even care anymore. Like,
Okay, I have the 30 minutes before this though recorded, so I wouldn't go. I'll say all that.
Yeah, that's true. I remember when we first met, I was always like trying to say the right thing. And I didn't want you to like be disappointed in me because I was like, oh, you have this idea of who I am.
Oh yeah, because I followed you.
TikTok.
I was your follower first.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, this is my God and my king.
It's like very careful about choosing my words.
I didn't know that. It's interesting because to me it was like I would have thought it would be the opposite, where you're like, I'm the big man on campus, the virtual campus. I'm that guy.
Dude,
I'm over here talking about Stregonona and Taylor Swift to like 30,000 people, and you're like,
you want to talk about like, this might be a little bit of anxiety. I don't know how pathologic this is, but I overanalyze interactions with fans so much. Like, I'll be waiting for an elevator and someone comes up to me and they're like, hey, you're Prezzo, right? I'm like, yeah. And they're like, dude, I'm a PA student. I love your stuff. Like, where are you going? Like, I'm going on my rotation. I'm like, oh yeah, just hanging out. Like, I'll see you later. And then I'm like in the interview, I'm like, stupid. Like, I'm like, you didn't ask him about himself,
wasn't
now
nearly funny enough.
He probably thinks you're like an aloof douchebag and all this stuff. And like, I like want them to feel like I come across genuine, and then I'm not. I'm like, it's funny. Like, you'd think you get all this confidence from like having fame and notoriety, but it's just, the monster just finds new things to sink its teeth into. Now I have new
you're about to
scenarios
just
to
lift up the
overanalyze.
puppet again. You're like the monster.
Speaking of
you are
monsters.
holding it though. Yeah, no, it's interesting, and I feel like social media plays such an interesting part in this question of loneliness. But we're talking today about loneliness and social anxiety disorder because, like you're saying, this kind of connection of how easy is it for people to meet new people, to interact with others, to be seen or noticed, or the kind of sensitivity to embarrassment. And I think it's something that gets talked about a lot online because of being, because of the pandemic and how that obviously all had to isolate, and then it felt weird to come out of isolation. And then obviously like the loneliness part we'll talk a little bit about more later. But I liked the question that you came up for the icebreaker, which was
I liked it at first, but I don't like it. What's something so embarrassing that you did socially you still think about today?
yeah. Do you want me to go first? Because I
Yeah,
can.
can you go first? That would help me.
So this is gonna speak to my like pathologic, like Catholic guilt of it all. But I remember there was this thing. I was in third grade. We had these little like wooden chairs we all sat in, and we would move them during like there was a part of like English class every month where we would like put on a little play for like a week, and we would move our chairs and do discussions. Da 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 da. And I remember there was this thing in my third grade class that was like funny for a couple weeks of like trying to like pull out your friends' chairs when they try to sit on
Mhm.
them and then they fall back and you all get a laugh. And I tried to do it to one of my friends and I did it and she like hit her head. She was fine. But I
Mhm.
remember and then she started crying and I was like felt so bad for her, but I also like I think I started crying. And I was like, I'm a bad person. I still like get freaked out thinking
Prank
about
gone
it.
wrong.
It could have got well, it did go wrong. And I was like, also was like, why are you so mean? Like, what's wrong with you? Why did you do that? Like, what evil is in you? It's
All the
like,
ways that like Margaret views herself as
yeah,
this like this kind supportive person, they're like the opposite of that.
it's not true.
You're everything you don't think you are.
See, this is what I knew about you. It's been true since the third grade. So that's mine. And I still think about, I
Okay.
don't think anyone, I don't know that that counts as social anxiety as much as just like a
It's like
heinous
totally
guilt,
public shame, yeah.
public shame and guilt. But yeah, this like, I don't
I mean,
know.
that's what a lot of social anxiety is, right? Perceived disgust of others.
Yes. Yes.
So, it sounds
Yeah.
like that's what you got.
Also of God. That was a fun part of it.
Yeah, God's always in the way.
Okay. Tell me yours that you do not want to
Okay.
say.
So, I
And now
think
you want to tell our listeners
I was a sophomore in college and, I went to a
in
military
2006, 2021.
yeah, um, I was in a military academy. So, it was actually 2020. No, that was med school, 2018.
I was like,
Um,
you're not that much younger than me.
yeah. So I was at a military academy, which I mean to say was like I was, I think, a little bit romantically stunted. The ratio was like 75% dudes and 25% girls.
College parties.
Yeah, Air Force Academy did not party a lot.
That
Um,
tracks.
and then like we were consistently ranked like top 10 most attractive guys schools in the country.
Mhm.
So like of this like small pool of girls, like I'm competing against like some of the
Alpha
hottest
predators.
dudes I've ever seen. Like
Alpha
yeah,
predator.
just like straight up specimens. These guys, they got their mustaches are better than mine. They're also like D1 football players. And they're going to be a fighter pilot, and then they're like engineers. I'm just like, nice.
And yet you've never introduced me to one of them. What's that? We'll come back to that.
You know, that's for the Patreon.
That's for the Patreon.
We'll
That's
do
what you're in
we'll do
school.
speed dating with Margaret and all my pilot friends. Some of
Attachment
which I
style in
have
action.
problematic
My
political
avoidance.
views, which we'll get into later.
I'm sure we have the same views.
Yeah. So the reason why I'm bringing all this up is that I like kind of felt awkward about approaching girls. I like if you ever texted a girl, you kind of had to accept that she was probably talking to like 6 or 7 other dudes. So I was like, honestly, I'm just gonna make it up as I go. So like we go out to Denver one night, we're like dancing in like the clubs, and like we're like a group of dudes like all in our circle, and there's like a group of girls over there, and like one of them kind of like gives me the eyes,
Mhm.
like you're moving around the club and she kind of looks at you and then looks away and then looks back at you and then looks away. And I was kind of like, oh, why does she keep looking at me? I'm like, is something on my face? Like, did you have a staring problem? Or something? No, I wasn't that bad. But her friend comes up and goes like, well, are you gonna make a move or are you gonna like keep standing there all night? And
Period.
I was like, oh, like never mind. Like this is served to me on a platter. So my move was like I saw this happen with like my friends who he kind of had like he was like a funny guy who had these like platonic relationships with girls, and he would like instead of the girl twerking on him, he would like twerk on the girl. And they would be like, oh, he's like so like it's sarcastic and flipped. It's funny. Like this guy's obviously like comfortable with his sexuality and stuff. And I was like, I think I'm gonna twerk on her. so so I started backing it up on her, and then and then she started screaming, and then all of her friends started screaming,
What?
and then they just ran off the dance floor. And I was just like sitting there
You said evacuate the dance floor, and they did. What
My
song
friends were
was
like,
it?
it was like Yeah by Usher.
How bad was it that you scared them?
I don't know. I think I
But
have
you must
good
have
hip.
really been backing it up, like, with
No,
a
I have good hip
vengeance.
mobility. Like I can isolate left cheek, right cheek. I can go back and forth if I
Okay.
need to. So I don't think it was a skill issue. Just think it was like inappropriate context, I guess. I don't know. But anyways, like if they say the worst she can say is no, that's incorrect. She can start screaming, and all of her friends can start screaming. They can run out of the club.
I
I
I
still
like
think about that, like when I think about that, that's like probably social anxiety, like my worst social nightmare.
so sometime when we're in the same city, I'm gonna be like, "Let's go out," and we're
No,
gonna
I
do
hate it.
exposure
I
therapy.
hate going to club. Like I only associate with like negative experiences now.
Wait, really?
Yeah, like
Is it
I
okay.
genuinely dislike going to clubs.
Like, is this, like, all bar dancing experiences?
No, I have fun like dancing with my friends if it's like a big group or like kind of like a chill vibe, but like clubs, like bottle service, dark room,
Okay.
strobe lights, stuff like that.
That's fair. That's fair. It's very high sensory. Yeah,
Okay.
so what we got
Well,
from our
enough
stories is
enough about
I'm a
this. I'm done
bad
with the icebreaker
person and
question.
Preston has committed a crime from
Hey, if
our
if serving on the dance floor is a crime, then lock me up.
That's true. Yeah, they just weren't ready for it yet. Maybe you were too good at it, and they were like, "How did a professional get in here?"
Yeah.
Something to consider. Okay. Well,
So, Margaret, what is social anxiety, and who even cares about that stuff? Like, why would I even care about social anxiety? Like, it clearly doesn't affect me
yes.
in any
So
way.
let's talk a little bit, I guess, about why for this episode. One thing, I mean, we film and prepare episodes earlier, but there was a trend on social media that was something like the rejection like challenge where people were going up to people and like being like, I'm trying to get rejected 100 times in whatever amount of days. And then there was also like the stuff of I'm gonna say his name wrong, which is gonna get Gen Z to flame me, but Timothy Chalamet. Is that right?
I think you said it right.
It's like Timothée technically, but whatever. I feel like they would flame me more for saying it that way. Where it was like all of his things that have been on the internet. Have you seen this? Like the videos of
Hmm.
him from like high school and college? And it was like,
He's like dancing in drag.
yeah, it was like, I know social anxiety hates to see him coming. Um, but I feel like it's also something like all of us experience anxiety, all of us experience social anxiety in some settings. And so I think it just like leads to an interesting conversation, especially as we talk about like the loneliness epidemic, as we talk about like how do people feel connected to each other in their communities, and of course the male loneliness articles we've seen
Yeah.
lately.
So, like, why do people distinguish like male loneliness from other types of loneliness?
Hmm.
Like why did
Yeah,
males get this special brand of loneliness?
it's guy stuff. Just dudes being bros, you know how it is. I actually don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's fascinating to me. There's some surveys I've studied. I can't cite the statistics well, but I think
Statistics. Sorry.
statistics. I think men are just less likely to have extensive friends once they enter their mid-20s. Like, if you were to survey someone who spends a lot more time alone, a lot of like blue collar men they'd like literally go to work, come home, stay by themselves, go to work again the next day, and that's just kind of it. They don't have a lot of like social outlets or like gathering groups, like or third spaces they hang out with. So I think that like men are maybe more stoic about it. So that's why it's like gotten its own like special type of brand.
Yeah. I feel like from the like feminist perspective, there's also, and like not just feminist perspective, as more women are thinking about like the 4B movement, which is, I'm not going to go into right now, but like as it becomes both more okay and also the discourse kind of and discord between men and women is present politically right now, I think there's sort of less relationships to some extent. And what happens when women are taking a step back from men? And like, what role do women play in men's life, which is often a more emotional one than their like male friendships,
Hmm.
right? And so, like, I think you like this gets into what they talk about in the loneliness, the 2023 document from the Surgeon General that defined loneliness more as like a lack of kind of meaningful and regular connection, and versus like solitude, and that like different people, obviously we know, can have like different levels of connection that feels good and connected to them. So he had defined in that document, which is like an 80-page thing from 2023, of loneliness as a subjective, distressing experience that results from perceived isolation or inadequate, meaningful connections.
So it's not like fetishizing your solitude. It's
No.
like a desire for connection and then
Not
none
having
to
the
be
needs
found.
met regularly. Yeah. Yeah. Because solitude is like, and I think the poets actually talk about this a little bit better, like this idea of, I think of like going on a walk. Right now it's winter and it's
It's
very
a
cold in
somber,
Boston.
contemplative experience.
Yeah. It can be very beautiful, right? And it can be connective, but that's different than this kind of overall lack of needs of connection and belonging being met.
Like a despondent isolation.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I wonder what you think about like the connection between rising loneliness, and if you think there might be a connection between that and I don't think we have studies on this yet in terms of data, but like higher levels of social anxiety, because I feel like that's talked about online a lot. Especially over the last couple of years, people talking about like feeling like they almost don't have their social graces muscles as strong as they were before the pandemic.
Yeah, I think that based on everything I know about the brain, it makes a lot of sense to me. I think most parts of our brain are, in a lot of ways, use or lose, I guess I would say. Like the same way muscle groups are. Like if an astronaut goes to space where they're not walking against gravity every day, their muscles and bones atrophy. And if you're not in a position where you're always just kind of recognizing social cues and social signals, even around like the water cooler or in the sidewalk or things like that, and you're just kind of, it's just you in a Zoom call for hours at a time. It's my hypothesis is almost like those parts of your brain that are attuned to like recognizing and responding to people's social cues just kind of almost like atrophy, like they're out of the game a little bit. And it takes a little bit to like recalibrate that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I tend to, I feel like I share the same kind of theory of it. It reminds me of like even thinking about like in medical school, like when you would go from like a surgery rotation to like a clinical, like an internal medicine or psych, or one that had like an outpatient component where there was like, you didn't have to be at the hospital, you weren't standing as much. Like some of that is physical, some of it is like mental, that it was like, oh wow, this feels like a relief. Whereas if you went from a similar specialty hours wise to the next one, it was like, oh, this
Whiplash.
is, yeah. But the having so much like more isolation leading to like less exposure to the kind of friction of day-to-day life with people, leads to that anxiety being higher, which we think about in social anxiety. So like when we think about social anxiety disorder, I want to give you a few examples and ask you from your kind of thoughts and what you know about psychiatry and also as a human being, how you think about.
So like a game show.
This is a game
Are you
show.
quizzing me?
What was your favorite game show as a kid?
Jeopardy.
Jeopardy. Okay, I can't relate. Mine was Price is Right. Also, Fear Factor, which we won't get into.
Does that count as a game show?
That was such a betrayal to me when I realized. I was like, "Where did you go?" I loved Fear Factor.
Yeah, we watched Fear Factor, so my mom would make me watch Survivor and Desperate Housewives mostly.
This explains so much about us because I also watched Desperate Housewives at a young age.
Okay. Well, contestant number 1 is ready.
Okay, contestant number 1. So we're gonna play. Would you be concerned for a social anxiety disorder, or you think it's normal or good or something else? That's not a very catchy name. I'm still workshopping that.
Okay.
Okay.
Welcome to. Do you think it's social anxiety disorder or is it normal? Like, should they get better? Okay. Today we have Preston.
Okay. Are you ready for scenario 1?
Hey, Margaret, happy to be here.
Hey, where are you from? Sorry. What's a compulsion?
I'm from Podcast Land. Okay, let's go.
Cool. A context. You're actually AI. I don't know if the viewers know that, but okay. So you're walking alone through the woods. You yourself, maybe you bring one of your cats along. You're walking along and you see a group of 8th graders, also in the woods going on a hike. You walk by and they start pointing and laughing at you. But then it seems like they point and laugh at something else too that's similar. And you hear them they keep
Mm,
laughing and they walk past you, and then it's a mile later and you're thinking about it and you're wondering who's about it. But an hour later, you're back home making lunch and aren't really thinking about it at all now.
mm.
What would you make of that anxiety response to that situation?
So I would probably understand having this initial feeling of shame as someone points and laughs at me. But then as I'm able to kind of apply my social context cues, I wonder if they're eighth graders who laugh and make fun of everything, and that them laughing at me probably isn't a reflection of anything I've done wrong, but rather their disposition towards the world as a bunch of 12-year-olds. So I would say this is a normal level of worry and
Mhm,
not a reflection of pathology.
mhm, mhm. Yes, and the fact that an hour later you kinda moved on,
Yeah.
uh,
And then it didn't linger.
didn't linger,
Mhm.
didn't make you change or do something different. Yes. Okay. I'm gonna give you a second example. Are you ready?
Okay. Yep.
Okay. You are at a party or club. Sorry, I didn't know your story. But you're at a party. Um, you are at a party. You just got there and you were brought by your friend who knows a bunch of people there. You don't know anyone besides one person who you did a rotation with at one point in neurology. You guys aren't that close. And so you don't go up to talk to them. Later, you're getting some snacks, you're getting a drink, and they're also there. They say, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" But don't say your name. You talk for a couple minutes and then they walk away and you see them walk over and start looking at their phone. For the rest of the party, you don't really connect with other people. And the next time your friend invites you to go to this a similar group of people's party, you say no and you think about that person.
Mhm. Does like, the thought of having to have that like, what are my thoughts about that interaction? Do they still
You're
linger with me even outside of the invitation to the party?
They linger and they make you also not go
Mm,
to the next one because
okay.
you're worried you're going to see that person.
Yeah. Do I anticipate any judgments they might have about me?
Yeah, you think that they think you're very odd and also that you're a waste of time to talk to.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
I would say we're now starting to enter the spectrum of social anxiety,
Yeah.
and part of that is because we can see, first of all, disorder. So if I wanted to go to the party and
Mhm,
I'm not going to the party, there's now an incongruence between my desires and my
mhm,
actions. So we are
mhm.
now seeing evidence of disorder
Yeah.
caused from these social perceptions. And then now, kind of looking at that anxiety portion, oh, I have seen a bunch of vague social cues that could be due to anything. Maybe they're going over and checking their phone because their mom is in the hospital and they're
Mhm,
sick, or maybe they're just kind of out of it that day. There are a million reasons why this person could be acting detached or vague around
mhm,
me. And if I'm coming to the conclusion that they must think I'm odd or weird and they dislike me,
mhm.
and I'm having trouble engaging with other like possible explanations, and my rigid hypothetical beliefs are now leading me to disrupt my social calendar. That's
Yeah.
evidence of social anxiety.
Yeah. So the
So,
avoidance part of it, the
mhm.
perseverance of it, and yeah, function change. Okay. Last one.
Yeah, this is easy. I'm just really smart.
uh the
Can you
last
have a
one.
hard one?
Yes, I'm going to.
Okay.
Those were both tests for effort. This is an actual one.
Okay.
um okay, situation. You are back in medical school. You are studying in the library. It is very quiet. Your friend comes up, sits down with you, and starts quietly studying. This is not unusual for the two of you. Later, you get up and you go and have a little lunch break together and are talking. And he tells you how he's been kind of struggling lately. He's been pretty anxious. He's been feeling like he's not connecting with people. He's not sleeping as much. He also tells you that he feels like, quote, people are out to get him. When you ask what he means by that, he says he just feels like people have been acting weird or that they don't like him. When you push a little further after reassuring him of your friendship, he states that he feels like people are tampering with his tests in medical school.
Mm,
Is this social anxiety? Or what is this? What would you
yeah.
ask?
So when he starts talking about people tampering with him, I would start to immediately ask about what he's seeing. Like, hey, what are signs that this tampering's happening? I'm just curious. So I don't know if you have that like ready or like what are some examples you might have.
He says that he feels like he saw
He
a
feels like or
like
knows
some
he saw.
he feels like he says he knows that he saw some strange that the lighting was different in the lecture room that day, and that was a sign that
Hmm.
someone kind of was messing
Someone's
with
like messing
things.
with the electricity, and
Yeah.
that's probably why his scores have been worse
Yeah.
because they're in the network.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so distinguishing this from anxiety can be kind of challenging, and I think
Uh-huh.
that um, this is more consistent with something we call paranoia.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
I won't think we'll dive into a lot of psychotic paranoia today, but an important difference is that
Yeah.
this person is describing responses to stimuli and conclusions that they're making about it in the moment.
Uh-huh.
Like the lights are flickering, therefore someone's on to me.
Yeah.
And that other social situation is worrying about like anticipated or like hypothetical scenarios like
Mhm.
what if they don't like me,
Right.
and then seeing if you can reinforce that belief.
Right.
So while both of them may be vulnerable to confirmation bias, like I think people are tampering with my tests,
Mhm.
therefore I'm going to interpret every kind of like weird electronic signal to be
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
versus I'm worried that people think I'm odd, so I'm going to like
Right. Like no one sits by me in
emphasize
that class.
negative
Yeah.
social, yeah,
Or like this
um,
person used to sit there and now they don't, and it's because I'm there.
responses. The difference is like almost this bizarre interpretation of reality.
The reality testing being kind of different than maybe what most people would say. Great.
And and then a lot of it is the making connections between things that don't,
Yeah. Yeah.
like you would normally
And
correlate
it's
that
like there's
together.
nothing that stops people who have paranoia or who have illnesses that usually have the symptom of paranoia. Like a lot of those people have comorbid anxiety as well, and
Hmm.
like that's not uncommon. And so things never present as we say, patients don't read the textbook or don't read the DSM,
Hmm.
and so these things like drawing them out can be difficult, like you were saying.
Yeah, and like functionally, what they're both feeling is hyperactivity of their sympathetic nervous system.
Yeah.
So that the feeling of fear that both the paranoid patient and the social anxiety patient feel is likely different to distinguish between them.
Yeah.
The actual like visceral sensation itself, the
Yeah.
intensity of it, the frequency would be much different.
Right. Yeah. So I guess what just a little bit in general, so we have a baseline to talk about with social anxiety of what the DSM calls it. So in the DSM
Mm.
5, which by the way, do you know when the DSM 5 came out?
It's like 2012, right?
2013, yeah. So
Mm.
and then do you know anything about the history of the DSM besides just like general psych stuff?
Not
Because this is where I
really.
shout out WashU. Uh, but I was reading in a 2010 paper on the kind of like working group and evolution of how they define and kind of delineate social anxiety as an entity in the going from the DSM-4 to the DSM-5. And so I shouted out WashU because they were very involved with how the DSM-3 came into being.
Mhm.
Um, One of those differences compared to the before, which I think is a relevant difference just in terms of how people refer to social anxiety, both clinically and then like pop culturally, is the idea of like a social phobia versus like social anxiety disorder.
Mhm.
Um, why do you think so? There's a change. At one point, it was called social phobia in the prior DSM, um, as in DSM-3, not DSM-4. What are your thoughts on why they might change it from like a phobia, like social phobia to social anxiety disorder?
That's super interesting. Let me see if I can articulate this. I'm when I think about a phobia, I'm like focusing on like a singular object or scenario where someone just repeatedly experiences fear. So like arachnophobia, for example, is this like disordered fear of spiders. My fear of spiders is not based off of like hypothetical or maybe wrongful misinterpretations of spiders' movements. It's just a almost unconditional response to spiders, period. So like social phobia would be like just fear of being around people, I guess, in that scenario. But like social anxiety isn't being afraid of people, it's being always worried about the judgments that people are making of you.
Right.
So I
no, I
think
think you're
that's like the
exactly right.
distinction.
I think they wrote about this in the paper, like the phobias generally and elsewhere in the DSM are more of this like very tightly circumscribed like fear of something specific, right? Like spiders.
Mhm.
Whereas social anxiety tends to be more expansive than that. But this gets into the second point I was going to make that they also talk about in this paper, which is like, should there be specifiers? Like, so how there's specifiers for um, different
Social
illnesses.
anxiety disorder club type, clubbing type.
Well, there's like, should there be such a thing as generalized social anxiety disorder versus like, should like, subsets of things like the type of
Oh, like
relationship?
in The Big Bang Theory, that guy who can't talk to women,
Uh,
Raj. Yeah. So like
yes.
social anxiety disorder, opposite gender type.
Yeah. And so they came to the conclusion based on a number of things that I will not go bore you with right now. But at that point, there is no generalized social anxiety disorder in the DSM-5. But so the conclusion was basically that like from a clinical perspective and from a population-based level, it didn't seem like it differentiated so much in terms of pathology and function when it comes to like anxiety in social settings as like different subtypes, i.e., it wasn't like this type of behavior or thing that they were
Mhm.
avoiding. All of this was more similar in in-group compared to this, as much as it clustered by severity, like how much,
Mhm.
and that it kind of, they end up saying it as like a spectrum. And so I sort of think of it as like someone with social anxiety where they're only nervous like in settings where they're meeting brand new people at like a certain type of environment, say the club, which can be disruptive to their life, right? Compared to people who are anxious and meeting anyone new and seeing people they already know at work, at home,
So it's on the
socially.
same spectrum, but just at a different level of severity.
Yes. Can you think of one that there might be something of a differentiator that was significant? I feel like
Public
this,
speaking.
yeah. So like performance anxiety,
Mhm.
responsive, which changes how we treat things, right? Like if someone, what do you think of that clinically as like a difference? Like if I said this person like full social anxiety disorder versus they have like public speaking, social anxiety or a phobia of like public speaking.
Yeah, I think like public speaking falls more under the umbrella of like a social phobia because it's a reproducible specific scenario where all eyes are on you and you're expected to do something. And almost like agoraphobia where like you're just afraid of being in the marketplace functionally. So I think that like the way that's organized in the patient's mind is much different.
Yeah. One of the things I looked at was like that might fall somewhere, like you're saying, between a phobia and a generalized thing. Because you can imagine someone who you think of as having performance anxiety with speaking in front of like a group at work, let's say, but they
Mhm.
worry about it constantly. They never stop worrying about it, even when it's not really coming up on their schedule. They wonder about it after, about how people interacted with them after their speech. And so, right, it expands. And that I think would become more of this broader social anxiety disorder. But it's what's common, I feel like a lot of people have, is more that there's almost like there's no extinction of the fear. It's like not common enough. And so it's like they give a speech at work once every or twice every year, and they have a
Mhm.
lot of anxiety like the day before it. And then after it, they're glad to be done. But that's kind of it.
Like 6 months before, or like
Yeah.
you're reorganizing your entire like career trajectory over the potential of ever public speaking again.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And
So
it
you can
infects
see
these
how
other kind of
much more
things.
severe it is.
And what would you treat someone with just that? Like, let's say you have a
So
patient who comes in and is like, I have this presentation coming at work and I always feel like I get sweaty and anxious the day
yeah,
before, right
I
before it.
would say propanolol would probably be a good choice for
Oh,
them
yeah.
as long as they don't have asthma. And
Yeah.
the reason being is that it's a good way to suppress release of norepinephrine. We actually have a lot of autonomic receptors that hang around in our temporal lobes and our amygdala. But once they're activated, they bind to everything. So after you're already anxious, propranolol won't do much.
Mm.
It's a good lock on the door, but it's not good at shutting the door
Hmm.
or corralling everything back in. In other scenarios, you may give something like a benzodiazepine, but if you want someone to be lucid and cogent for their presentation, I don't think a benzo would be a great choice.
Because it would be sedating, which
Hmm.
Not always the best vibe for a presentation.
I mean, yeah, just trying to be
Like, I'm
chill.
just being a
So
chill
maybe on a
guy.
plane or something, if all you have to do is sleep.
Yes, yeah, and because you're right, like, in terms of, like, more singular phobias.
Mhm.
Um, and a couple other things I just wanna say about social anxiety general, um, is this kind of, like, what people I'm moving to the side, sorry. What people think about as, like, kind of 3 baskets of symptoms that we think about with
Mm.
social anxiety, because it's not just, like, I'm nervous to go see my friends.
Yeah.
Um But it's how they define it, like in the paper in the DSM, is this like marked fear or anxiety about one or more social situations in which it's possible to have one, scrutiny by others. Um, so nervousness around social interactions, being observed, or performing in front of others are the kind of 3
Mm.
buckets they give. Um, and so I feel like one of the ones I didn't think about in reviewing this is like the being observed.
Mhm.
Um, which I did jokingly say when we started this podcast that this is my exposure therapy. And I was like, no, hold on, I'm reading this. But yeah, so social interactions under scrutiny, being observed, or performing in front of others. So that like sense of judgment.
Mhm.
I wonder what you think social media adds to this sense of judgment or like level of thinking about other people thinking about you in the general population.
I think that it takes that third bucket of like being perceived and it just like spams it to
Yeah.
like it's a multiplier beyond like our comprehension because I think a lot of humans are used to being in these tribes of like 40 people and social anxiety was probably great when like we're all in our like Caucasus mountain hunter gatherer tribes and somebody like trips and everyone kind of laughs at them and like, oh, I'll focus more on like, keeping my balance. But I've survived the judgment of 10 of my peers. Now, if I do something stupid or like I misspeak on a video and it goes viral, my brain can't comprehend getting roasted by like millions of people. Like it's like it goes outside of like what your brain can deal with and it just kind of goes on overload.
Yeah. 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 I think like it's one of the reasons I've like avoided talking on TikTok is like the fear of nothing specific, but just that of like and fear to some extent. Like, is it pathological to fear that? Like it's such a weird setting to be like, okay, well, maybe you should be afraid to speak in front of like what like I don't know, is that normal human behavior or not?
Yeah, I mean, like I do ridiculous stuff online all the time. Not that ridiculous, but I'm still afraid to go on live. I can't do it.
Yeah.
I've thought
Yeah. Oh,
about it and I
interesting.
struggle because I just don't want I protect myself. And the
Yeah.
one barrier is that I have a chance to
Mhm.
review the footage and record it and edit it before I post it.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
going on live, I can't hack it yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um
Well, it makes me
my
think of like what would a concept this is not a DSM thing, but like what would parasocial anxiety look like? Like if that was a disorder of like difficulty connecting in social ways online, like anxiety about being perceived that would be pathologic. That's not a real thing. But
Mhm.
it would be
Anxiety about
interesting
being
to think
perceived
about.
by the crowd or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that'd be interesting.
but yeah, and then I guess a couple other things that it notes in this is just like there's a lot of overlap, especially in like adolescents and kids thinking about like selective mutism, which is like children who don't talk in most situations besides like with a parent or like a trusted like sibling or friend.
Mhm.
And there's a lot of overlap with that, though it's not the same. So they're separate things. And then thinking about avoidant personality, like style
Mhm.
versus social anxiety disorder. And they pull those apart because one of the things is that someone can be avoidant and withdrawn. And the thing they bring up is kind of similar to this example with paranoia that like that can kind of happen in psychotic disorders as well. And so they didn't want to be like avoidant personality type and social anxiety disorder are the same,
Mm.
collapse them into one thing because there can be kind of this difference. Yeah. So,
Like the
yeah.
same type of behavior is achieved with kind of a different motivation
Yes. And that
or a
interiority
different
is,
compulsion.
yeah, should make you think of different things. Do you have anything to add in terms of like clinically what you like, what kind of perks your ear when someone says something to you that makes you be like, huh, maybe you need to be thinking about this for you and how I can
Yeah.
help from this angle?
So when I'm interviewing patients, I love to ask about what ifs. Like, do
Mm.
you find your mind just saying, what if, what if, what if, what if, what if? And they're like, yes. They're worried about that. And then when I'm trying to distinguish between something like generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety, I say, I'll ask people, how are they able to kind of get out of an anxiety spiral? Because I think everyone who's had anxiety kind of knows what it's like to be caught in that loop that you can't pull yourself out of. For example, like if I can't fall asleep, then I'll be more tired tomorrow, so I'll do bad on my exam. So I just need to fall asleep. But now I'm not falling asleep, so it's making me more anxious, which is giving me more awake. And so it's like it's like an eddy that you get stuck in. So when I ask someone, when you finally break out of that eddy or that kind of loop, does another thing just fill its place, or does it kind of go away?
Yeah, that's a
And
good
then a
question.
lot of times people with anxiety, they're like, the second the loop's broken, something else just shows up.
Yes.
And then I kind of ask about the themes of those things. And so sometimes it could be they go from worrying about their grades to all of a sudden worrying, is my mom going to get hit by a car? To, do I have cancer? To, is the terrorist going to attack my city? And that's more of like a generalized picture. But sometimes when I ask them about like the next thing, it's like I go from thinking my girlfriend hates me to next thing I'm worried about like if my small group even likes me. And so the theme of like something always replacing the next thing they're worrying about stays within the kind of guardrails of their like social environment. So that kind of like prompts me a little bit. And then I kind of dive in and ask them like, how do you read people? Like, do you have trouble reading people, or do you guys feel like you can tell what people are thinking?
Yeah. Well, I feel like that's like where an interesting thing with like depression versus social anxiety. Like in depression, depression can impact someone's like self-worth and self-esteem, self-evaluation, and others to be more negative. And so like we treat depression and social anxiety differently to some extent. We use SSRIs for both, but like the therapy might look different.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think like depression might sound like versus social anxiety in terms of that like evaluation of what people think?
Yeah. So they're both connected by social being like socially withdrawn or social detachment, right? So I would ask if you even feel like hanging out with people anymore. And in both depression and social anxiety, the answer could be no, which would you expect? And then I'd just say why. And so someone with depression might say it's not worth it. I just don't feel like going out of the house. I have no energy to even leave my bed.
I'm not. I wouldn't be fun to
and like I
interact
don't
with.
care. Like what's the point of even hanging out with people anyways? We're all gonna die.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like that. Like when I hear like a statement like that, I'm like, whoa.
I feel like that wouldn't be fun for people to even interact with anyway. Is one that I think about depression too.
Yeah, like I'm not worth spending time with.
Yeah.
I'm so worthless. There's nothing of value to me. That why would anyone even care? And then with social anxiety, sometimes if people have like more resistance to it, they'll say like, oh, I don't get anxious at parties. I just hate parties. And so now I don't even want to go to them. And they're just a chore to me. So I'm like, so what do you do instead? They're like, oh, I always try to like crochet or play video games with my friends, or like I'll do like things with like one or two people, but like I'm just not a big party person, And then I kind of probe a little bit like, why do you hate parties? Like, what about these things suck? And they're like, oh, they're loud, it's crowded, everyone's always saying stuff. I'm like, do you find yourself just like worrying the whole party about what people are thinking of you? And that's like kind of a more specific question I'll ask. And then I would say about if I suspect social anxiety, it's 60% of the time I get a yes to that. They're like, yeah. But they're like, I can't freaking even like pick out what I want to wear. So like, why would I spend 40 minminutes picking out an outfit because I know everyone's going to judge me?
Right.
I'm just not going to go.
And it's like, it's totally cool if people don't like certain things, but I think that's like a constant thing in helping people with different anxiety disorders is helping them explore like, hey, you've lived with this disorder maybe for a long time, and maybe it's genetic in some ways. So like maybe your family also interacts in this way, but like, do you not like the club, or are you afraid the club doesn't like you is like a very two different things. And so helping them unlock that, I think that's a really good prompt.
Yeah. Do you hate yourself so much that it's not worth going to the party, or do you hate the party so much that you're remodeling your entire life around?
Are you
avoiding
afraid the party's going to hate you? And
yeah, exactly.
So I feel like there's that like future kind of worry-oriented part of social anxiety, whereas depression is like, I'm not worth it. And obviously these can overlap and have, comorbidity as well. But I think this also gets at what we're going to talk about after our break that Preston is going to talk a little bit about, which is that these disorders like mental illness, not only can they be comorbid and happening at the same time, but they also all are located in our brains and have some shared neurocircuits. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience.
Yeah. So I did some digging, and then we'll come back in a little bit and see what I found to feel like a scientist for the day
Heck
as
yeah.
we discuss social anxiety or just really feeling anxious around people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when I tried to take on the task of exploring the neuroscience behind social anxiety, it was a bit overwhelming, to
Mm-hmm.
be honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if you just type in social anxiety and brain function, you're gonna like immediately find like a million papers, and they get very dense into looking at resting state potentials
Mm-hmm.
of different neurocircuits and fMRI and things like that. And
Can
a
you
lot of these structures have a lot of the same problems.
Yeah. Quick question just for myself and, listeners, but also
Mhm.
myself. How would you simply explain like neurocircuitry as an approach to understanding, like, because I think it's different than how we used to think about it even like 30
Yeah,
years ago.
it is. So Um, I think an easy place to start is with just like the concept of a neural network.
Hmm.
And when you think of a neural network, I want you to think about um, basically an input and an output from a machine. So let's say I press a button on a machine and it gives me a thumbs up. It's just like that's it. There's a
Hmm.
single node, and that node says input button press, output thumbs up.
Hmm.
Now we have, let's make it a little more complicated of a neural network. Let's
Hmm.
add two nodes. Now we have one node that says input button press, thumbs up, but then maybe if it's two buttons are pressed, then it's a thumbs down.
Hmm.
A very simple neural network. So now
Hmm.
imagine that times
A
10
billion.
different
Yeah.
nodes, times 10,000 different nodes. And then those nodes affect other networks. And
Hmm.
then some of the networks are actually nodes crossing each other.
Hmm.
But functionally, it's always the same thing. You
Hmm.
input a stimulus and you get a product
Right.
coming out the other side. So, like a neural network could be functioning around like me flipping my light switch or something like that. So, how that might work for our brains is different tasks or things that we want to achieve. We kind of categorize that and then we test how our brain lights up when those things happen. So, a great example of this could be like, um, when you visualize an object in space, we have a certain neural network that's responsible for looking at the color of an object and another one that looks at the shape of it. And so it turns out that if I'm watching on a screen and I look at the color green and I look at a square and I look at the color green, maybe this part of my brain lights up for green, this part lights up for square, and then both light up for green square.
Right. Right.
So we can use that to say, like, okay, when I'm asking the brain to picture this thing, a really concrete object, like a polygon, I can see these things. Now, let's try to do the same thing, but for something like attention. It starts to get really complicated really fast because these are abstract concepts. And say, like, what about empathy? How do we measure empathy by like looking at someone's brain? And so,
And the research can look at any node along the network.
mhm. Yeah, so we have these what's called a voxel, which is basically a pixel in 3D space along the fMRI that kind of exists somewhere. And then each voxel has a certain size that has a certain level of activity
Huh. Can you
on
say
like,
fMRI?
oh, sorry, functional magnetic resonance imaging. So,
Which I feel like we talk a lot of. You see it a lot on like
yeah.
online or like an article like in New York Times or something, and it's like fMRI. What does it mean to you when someone says fMRI versus MRI studies showed?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question. So, and then, yeah, for anyone who's not familiar with this, MRI is really just like a snapshot in time. So it's think about like a single photograph that you're able to take. And then I would think about fMRI almost like one of those like live photos that you can take on your iPhone, where you can kind of like look at a snapshot of activity. The difference between them is that with functional, the F part of it, functional fMRI, is that you're looking at how much blood flow is going to certain parts of the brain. So the hypothesis is that when a certain part of your brain is more active, it's going to need to burn more energy. And that means it needs ATP. So it's going to demand more oxygen. So it's going to suck more oxygen out of the red blood cells in your blood. So it turns out that you have iron deep in your red blood cells. And when you actually dump that oxygen off, the hemoglobin, that part that carries iron in a red blood cell, it changes shape a little bit. And that little bit of shape that's changed can be detected on the magnetic signal. And we follow those like really microscopic changes in magnetic signal to see, oh, these parts of the brain have these different states of iron, which are associated with more oxygen and therefore more
Different.
brain
Yeah.
activity. Yeah.
Got it.
So that's kind of how we can go backwards and say there's more activity here. There are some flaws in that though, because just because a part's using more blood or more oxygen doesn't always necessarily mean it's more active, but in a lot of times it is.
Mm.
There can be like
Okay.
issues with the sensitivity and specificity of fMRI. So a lot of fMRI can come under scrutiny when it comes to using it for diagnosis, for example, which is why a lot of diagnosis is still performed clinically. It can be helpful if we like know this person slam dunk has schizophrenia and now we want to look at how their brain works, but going the other way, it's not too helpful.
Gotcha. Okay. That's helpful. That's helpful. It's also like, I feel like I haven't reviewed like what fMRI's process actually is in a couple years. And so that was helpful to me also.
Yeah.
Like, oh
Yeah, of
yeah, it is.
course.
I do that is ringing a bell. It's kind of just like my brain, automatically is like, yeah, fMRI, this is what's happening vaguely, but that's a helpful
Yeah.
review of it.
So like, and a lot of times the way they do these studies is they do like a resting state function. So they just say, just chill out. We're just going to look at how your brain functions. And then they give you a task. And then they kind of see, okay, we mapped all these nodes in your head while you're resting. Now we're going to map all of them again while you're doing a task. And we're seeing which ones decrease in activity and which ones increase in activity.
Mhm.
And from doing hundreds of those tests, we've been able to kind of conclude like, oh, there are these like really complicated networks that maybe they're not related to anatomy necessarily, but it's a constellation that always lights up.
Mhm.
Like, for
Mhm.
example, every time we tell someone to just chill out, this network lights up. And we say, hey, focus on reading.
Right.
This network always lights up. And we kind of start to figure out that like there's a node that's responsible for daydreaming, like a
Right.
set of nodes.
Yep.
And a set of nodes that are responsible for like paying attention to something. And that's kind of how we started to like make these conclusions.
Well, I feel like this like it's a complicated idea, but this foundational kind of basic idea is why like so much stuff online adds to the confusion for like ourselves if we're not in this field, and then also like patients where it's like, oh, like your cortisol is high. That's why you're experiencing all these things. And it's like that no, like maybe you do have that, but right, this kind of understanding, this oversimplification, but then also like the same way people be like, oh, cortisol does this, like, and that's why you feel this way in your brain, whatever. There also is this kind of oversimplified
Mhm.
sense or misinterpretation of the research.
People complacently draw conclusions from
Yeah.
it.
But of like, no, of like, yes. But the like kind of thought that like it's different brain sections and each section does its own job instead of this kind of
Mhm.
much more complicated and interesting overlapping networks.
Yeah. Um, a lot of it like feels more like a CPU and a graphics card and other things. Like the computer analogy has
Yeah.
been more relevant to me as I learn more about the
Yeah.
brain.
Yeah.
So now kind of like taking this kind of understanding of like how we even try to
Mhm.
look at the neuroscience of disorders to specifically social anxiety. And like I said, there was a lot that overwhelmed me when I first looked it up. So I kind of tried to divide it initially into two big buckets. So I was like,
Mhm.
okay, let's just look at the social part. So I was curious, like, how do we think about just interpreting someone's face
Mhm.
when you see them? Like, how does our brain help us recognize things? Because I'm sure you've heard of like the uncanny valley
Yeah.
or something like that,
Yeah.
where it's like everything in like the human mind is kind of programmed to recognize a face
Mhm.
out of the crowd. And when we see something that looks like similar to a face but not, it kind of makes us feel uncomfortable. It feels wrong.
But what about
So
when there's like, why does it make me feel happy when there's like an inanimate object that's like a little smiley face? That's like in my like morning coffee, there's like two bubbles in a line and it looks like a little smiley. Why do I like that? Is there something
probably
wrong with
probably
me,
because you
Preston?
know so certainly that it can't be a human,
That's fair.
that you can
Okay.
just like reminisce.
Proceed.
Um, yeah. So when we think about the structures that affect that,
Mhm.
there's the temporal lobe, and that houses your hippocampus, which is where you remember things. So obviously, you want to remember a face. You see one again. Then we have the frontal lobe that kind of works through the reasoning of all this input that we're getting. And then we have the amygdala, which is tightly related to fear and anxiety. And we'll get into that a little bit later. And then we have something called the fusiform face area. So
Mm.
it turns out on the bottom side of the temporal cortex, there's a specific area that's like really only responsible for recognizing faces.
Hmm.
It's so that's actually an exception where there are dedicated parts. It just turns out that recognizing faces is so important in human life that we're just like, you know what, we're gonna set aside these resources just for that.
You get your own condo over here.
Yeah. And so these things can be fooled in different ways, especially if you have strokes in different part of your temporal cortex. You may be able to recognize that someone's a human, but you just have no idea who they are. So you can recognize faces, but you can't name them. And so they're anywhere in this network, something can kind of get knocked out. But what we're interested in is, how does this interpretation of someone's face lead us to be anticipating judgment, or always be worried that they're afraid of us? So I kind of wanted to look into now, like, how do we process anxiety in a lot of ways? And when you think about anxiety, you really just want to think about the sympathetic nervous system being activated. And so that's going to contain things like the hypothalamus, the cingulate gyrus, the basal ganglia, and then the amygdala, obviously. So I think even like high school psychology, I remember the first thing I learned was that the amygdala was in charge of like your fight or flight response, or generating fear. And it was like fascinating for me to learn how much of a role it had also in facial recognition, and how close those two things work in that same network. So now, if we want to start like looking at
what do you mean how close they work together? Or like what struck you about that?
So basically what I'm saying is that we're running all of these circuits at the same time. And so there's a circuit that's running fear, 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 and it's hitting all these different nodes, and it's passing through the amygdala. And there's one that's running recognize face, recognize face, recognize face. And that's also overlapping through the amygdala. They're both of those circuits that have like separate functions are passing through the amygdala while they're doing their independent function. So I guess what I'm getting at is like, wonder if there's something wrong with the amygdala, if it could have implications in both fields.
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I started looking at amygdalar function on fMRI and social anxiety disorder very specifically. And there's actually a lot of data that like really starts to dive into what happens in the amygdala. So I found a meta-analysis that was going over it. And what they found is that patients with social anxiety disorder have higher resting state activity and function of the amygdala. It's just kind of hyperactive. And so their perceptions of faces may be manipulated in some way. We can't make a neat conclusion from that, but their limbic system might be a little bit more active. Then they took the groups that had higher levels of baseline amygdala function and diagnosed social anxiety disorder, and they presented them with different faces with kind of standardized expressions. This is something we do a lot in neuroscience tests. So you have a face with like the standardized expression for fear, or for happiness, or for anger. And you ask them to rate how much stress they had in response to those faces. And we also looked at their brain activity. And what we found is that compared to normal controls, people with social anxiety disorder were more likely to have negative responses to neutral reactions and neutral faces from people, and actually had stronger, more visceral reactions to negative emotions. They perceived and experienced the emotion disgust more intensely when looking at faces.
That's interesting.
Another thing that was fascinating is that the amygdala directly connects to your insula. So it's kind of like right there in the middle. That affects how you viscerally feel reactions to a lot of things. So one thing that the authors hypothesized was that the amygdala is functioning at a higher level, and it's actually causing that person to feel subjectively more distress than another person. And also they are interpreting more neutral social responses negatively. And it's funny to say all this stuff so scientifically when this is basically just parroting that scenario that you talked about earlier, where I see someone walk away on their phone and they're tired.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting. And I know from my reading in like the eating disorder world and like and the trauma world, like one of the things, like the connection to like the insular cortex. It is an insular cortex, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Is this like kind of body awareness, body sensation, visceral sensation. And like when we're talking about like the performance anxiety in particular, and what treats that
you like
versus
feel
others.
It in your gut.
Yeah.
It's a visceral sensation.
Yeah, so it's fascinating.
One thing that I found really interesting when I was reading about this too was that the anterior cingulate gyrus came up a lot along with the insula, and those are implicated a lot in both attention and also in ADHD. So there's a section of ADHD where people can have rejection sensitive dysphoria. And ADHD is also comorbid with anxiety. So that actually made me really curious about how quickly someone may come to conclusions about sensations that they're observing, or how fast they make almost impulsive judgments from their environment, could be like somehow playing a role in this like rejection sensitive dysphoria that we see in ADHD. Because amygdala, like the amygdala, the insula, the anterior cingulate cortex, inferior temporal lobes, like they're all just like right there, you know? And so like anxiety doesn't have to walk far to start messing with ADHD. And it's funny because like when I was learning at med school, I would tell patients, I'm like, yeah, like ADHD is kind of like neighbors with anxiety. Like sometimes they hang out, sometimes they don't. We don't know. And then now when I'm like getting more into the anatomy of it, I'm like, they kind of are neighbors. Like,
Yeah, like that was maybe a little
like there's like a center either way.
I was
It
onto
was
something.
like a lot closer than I thought. Yeah. And then they're always interacting with each other.
Well,
So I
it's
found that.
interesting too to take that and ask like I think of like some of my patients with like ADHD and comorbid anxiety or ADHD that has anxiety, whatever you want to call it, right? Like if we take into it also the like lifelong neuroplasticity of the brain of like, is it comorbidity in this person or that person, or is it like the plasticity of the response to the environment with an ADHD brain that then sensitizes maybe the network of the social anxiety or the rejection, right? Like, how does this come into being? That is a whole rabbit hole we could fall down, but it's so interesting.
It really is.
Yeah.
So the next part that I want to talk about is, okay, now we've taken our pictures the best we can of how things go wrong, but what about if we can fix this, if we try to treat this? So as we talked about earlier, we give SSRIs to treat social anxiety disorder.
Right.
And I was really curious about changes in amygdala function with SSRIs. And there's actually some pretty interesting recent studies that have come out where they did fMRI of signal changes of the amygdala in patients before and after taking SSRIs.
Do you know how long they took this? Like, was it like they took them for a month, a year?
I think it was for 10 weeks.
Nice. Okay, cool.
So they gave it a full trial. And then, so for caveat, this study that I'm looking at right now has 5 participants in it. So the problem with a lot of these fMRI studies is that the numbers are very low. And so the conclusions are always, this is promising data, but more research needs to be done.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But there is some really interesting stuff that came through. So for this study specifically, they were actually looking at patients with depression. It was only looking at the amygdala, but the amygdala has some implications in depression too. So kind of suspend your disbelief or reservations about like only talking about social anxiety disorder. Remember that a lot of these anatomical functions are transdiagnostic, and that we're just trying to like look at this function. So they looked at, resting state amygdala functions before and after they were given compliments, actually. So they would put these patients in a room and say, hey, you look nice today.
I like your hat.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so what they found is that some patients, compared to normal controls, didn't really respond well to the compliment at all. They had lower signals, and those were the depressed patients. And then they gave the intervention group SSRIs, and they found that some responded to the SSRI and others didn't. And then when they looked at the signal change, so the responders almost reached the same signal responsiveness to a compliment as the healthy control, and the non-responder didn't. And this is taking the fMRI and looking directly at the amygdala, and then just seeing how much does that signal change when I say something nice to this person.
Yeah.
Because this is how much this person is perceiving like negative and positive things in their social environment. So the other thing that they were able to find is that outside of these compliments that they were giving people, when they were looking at the resting state function of the amygdala, it decreased when they gave SSRIs. So increasing serotonin was almost able to kind of temper the basal amygdala function.
And when you say it's like the resting level, it was like more elevated in those with depression before the SSRI, which lowered the resting function. What is the significance of that? Because I think I hear it and it's like, oh, okay, if it's higher up, that's bad because higher, like more activity means more anxiety. But I also know that there's like, a complexity to that in terms of like the rest. Like if you think of, I don't know, you think of the complexities that we've started talking about culturally and scientifically about like dopaminergic signaling, that like the delta is the thing that signals it more than the like absolute level. So what do you think
Yeah.
of that
So
when
I think we
yeah.
have to make some. I may be misinterpreting what I'm reading here, but we are almost starting with the postulate that we've diagnosed this person with depression. Therefore, whatever state their amygdala is at is the
Mhm.
state associated with depression.
Right. Okay. Got
So
it.
their amygdala is hyperactive in this depressive state.
Mhm.
And then we see this change with our therapy and we assume that changes in the right direction because there are some disorders where it's hypoactive and then we see hyperactivity when we
Right.
give the medication.
Right.
For example, the anterior cingulate cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex have hypoactivity in ADHD, but we
Mhm.
stimulate that activity when we give
Gotcha. Gotcha.
Adderall.
Okay.
So I think that we kind of have to assume what we
Yeah.
know to be true and
Yeah.
then
We're at the
kind
edge
of
of the science in some
guess
ways
from
there.
there. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of this is really just saying we're observing changes clinically and we're observing changes on the machine
Yeah.
or on the instrument.
Yeah. No, that's super
And
interesting.
we're kind of we're doing our best to apply the scientific method and draw conclusions based off of that.
yeah.
So it's still, like I said, a long time before we can use this for diagnosis. I don't know if we ever will, because in a future where you could go into a brain scan and they could say, according to your fMRI, you have social anxiety, and you're like, I don't feel like I have social anxiety. Like I feel fine. Like I'm not going to gaslight you and force you to take an SSRI. But I think it's really interesting to say, oh, we know this part of the brain affects how we view faces. We know this part of our brain affects how we feel anxiety, how we create these hypothetical situations. And we know that when we give someone this pill, it makes them feel better. And now we can actually detect these different changes on an instrument, showing us that like what we're doing is real. And we are like affecting the circuitry of the software of our brain functionally.
And I feel like, like you said, it's so hard to like go into this research because it is the developing edge in a lot of ways in terms of like
Hmm.
like there's not clinical guidelines that are like this is how all psychiatrists or like neurologists should think about what these studies mean and implement this, right? There's not a concrete answer, but I feel like showing people, on this podcast and in general as like mental health professionals, like, okay, here's kind of a part of the edge of where we are is so important because I think it's so misinterpreted so often or
Hmm.
oversimplified.
Hmm.
So thank you for diving in and not making me
Yeah,
do that
of course. I
work
mean,
this
I
time.
love doing this stuff. And it's helpful for me because I like being able to think, okay, like increasing this person's serotonin is going to help their amygdala function, but then also I need to talk to them to think about like why they have such a rigid belief system that if
Mhm.
they fail a test or if they don't look good at a party, their life is over.
Right.
Because they've also have beliefs that are buried in
Yeah.
there, and their frontal lobe that's coming to certain conclusions is also influencing their amygdala. So we don't have meds to fix your frontal lobe, but you can talk to a therapist who can help
Right.
you reframe some of that.
And I think what we're going to spend the last couple minutes talking about is kind of the therapy part, the medication part. I think there's a lot of good guidance on SSRIs and
Hmm.
kind of adjunct medications, but we know for social anxiety disorder that CBT is the gold standard from therapy, but that both are effective. And when we think broadly therapeutically in terms of like what responds well to certain subsets of therapy, a lot of the anxiety disorders do respond quite well to a structured therapy. So,
Hmm.
in this case, in social anxiety, the CBT kind of protocol for treating it, especially the behavioral part, is probably the most active ingredient in the CBT for social anxiety, which again is true in a lot of anxiety or phobia disorders.
Hmm.
Um, so, let's say, like, from a therapeutic perspective, we started someone on a medication, but they're also getting therapy. For social anxiety, I feel like the things I would ask my patients about, like in the therapy setting, is first information gathering, like you talked about, right? So this asking about like where are things first of all not working the most for you? Because like
Hmm.
they might be inhibited in this setting and this setting, but they really are coming because they're coming to therapy and doing this work because it matters a whole hell of a lot to them that this
Hmm.
part of their life doesn't feel right to them or doesn't feel it isn't working with their family, it's causing issue. So starting in a place that the patient cares about, I think in general is a good thing. And then I feel like the first stage of therapy is a mixture of like psychoeducation around what we know on a simpler level of how does this get maintained and how do we, through kind of consistent exposure and then preventing the response, right?
Mhm.
How do we help decrease that anxiety and the sensitization to the anxiety? Um,
Mhm.
I think that's the active ingredient for social anxiety kind of cross therapy modality. I myself am ACT and psychodynamically oriented and trained. And so, but I think when I look across CBT, ACT, even sometimes psychodynamic or interpersonal work, it's pulling someone to the kind of emotionally salient thing over and over again until it's integrated and causes less of a stress response to some
Yeah.
extent.
So when you say exposing someone to the emotionally salient thing over, do you mean almost just kind of like desensitizing them
Yeah.
to that
Yes.
hypothetical possibility or that belief?
Yes. But
Okay.
and not thinking of it as like the kind of like experiments
Like
you think
playing
of
out a
the
worst case scenario.
yeah. So that, and again, I think the psycho ed part is an active ingredient in this as well of like
Mhm.
there's a lot of kind of like beliefs we can have not just about ourselves but also about like how do our brains work. And I feel like one of the biggest things that changed me as a therapist positively in residency so far has been getting training at an OCD institute in ERP specifically and just seeing the way done well and done compassionately and with an understanding towards also like how mindfulness goes into it and how to pace it correctly for people being trauma informed, all those things. But seeing what it can do for people over time. And this was in like a residential setting where it was like they were doing exposures every day with like a clinician on staff. So when I say like in social anxiety, like let's say you have someone, let's say you have like a college student who actually they come to you, they're like, but I'm let's say you have someone who's like 25-year-old, they're living in a city, they come to you and they say, I used to be a little bit anxious, but I was able to push through it before the pandemic happened. And now like I want to be able to go to bars, I want to be able to go to concerts, and I just get like so anxious going with my friends and being around strangers. And I haven't been able to do it since COVID. Like it felt like something changed. One of the things that would have changed is the sensitization to the stimuli, right? Like you didn't have it. And maybe if you're someone who kind of weren't socially anxious as often because you were forced in routine, then you were able to cope. But when it was COVID and you were at home for a year and a half without any stimuli, kind of like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, that ability and like the sensitivity to it is like the sensitivity is much higher and the ability feels like a whole lot more effortful and fearful.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating that desensitization is also a technique used in phobias. So we were talking about the difference between phobia and anxiety at the beginning, but now we're kind of coming back to similar treatments to it's really just almost like deconditioning your fight or flight response to a stimulus.
Right. Well, and similar to
It feels
like,
like Pavlovian almost.
yeah. Well, and I think adding that compassion and then adding the part of like exploring beliefs or the kind of cognitive component is important, especially I think so much of our identity comes from who we are in relation to others. So if you have a long history of, or like a traumatic history, or just a significant history of having a really hard rejection, feeling disconnected from people, bullying, any of these things, or like not feeling connected in a certain setting, like at work,
Mhm.
on talking about the narrative and schema around that cognitively, in addition to doing the exposure work and adding these mindfulness and compassion components, are all part of, not being a pure behaviorist, I think, and making
Yeah,
the
yeah.
therapy.
It's like the therapeutic physical exam. I guess like all humans need to belong, like full stop, period. So just like how I need oxygen and food and water, I need to belong. And so if my belongingness is thwarted for whatever reason, or I perceive it to be, that's going to cause emotional injury. And so if it's you can teach someone to tolerate that emotional injury over and over again with coping skills or exposing them to it, but like is that emotional injury coming from true rejection or is it almost like made up
Right,
by these weird beliefs?
right,
So,
right,
you're kind of teaching someone to tolerate the fist, but also realize that like maybe they're punching themselves
right.
at the same time.
And I'll say like I would never like have someone come to me on appointment 3 and we're working on social anxiety together and like be like, okay, that biggest thing you fear that you're horrified of doing? we're not going to start there. Similar that you wouldn't probably have someone like go, I know you're marathon training right now, Preston, like be like, okay, it's time to do like a sub 6-minute, 10-mile run right now. Like
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't have someone start there and you would be likely to injure them. That would be irresponsible, I think, therapizing in some ways. And so it is much more, again, compassionate because we're also teaching people with social anxiety, like they're often very critical of themselves. And so we don't want to re-entrench that belief while doing exposures of like, you have to do this perfectly or you're bad.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great point you had about them being critical of themselves. A lot of, I guess I was to take more like psychoanalytic lens to this is projection. So they are judging themselves. They think they're worthless. And then they are perceiving that other people, they're projecting that judgment onto other people and saying like, they feel this way about me. So a lot of it is this almost like a maladaptive response to internalized feelings of worthlessness.
Yeah. So I think, we're probably at the end of the time. So maybe we'll come back to more on loneliness in another episode.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we've talked about it at different points, like throughout this episode of how there can be this relationship and how we think about it coming into being, responding to meds, this kind of like anxiety and social settings response. But I think there's a clear connection between the loneliness epidemic and how do we think about the way out of it for people? Like, how do we think about loneliness as something we talk to our patients about? And there can be a many, many reasons for loneliness that are not, I don't mean them as like, this is like, if we fix your personal thing, then you won't feel lonely.
Yeah.
There are a lot of structural and societal problems that contribute to the loneliness issue. But
so I was watching Industry and it was HBO, like British Succession, basically. But there's a line there by this character, Robert. He says, there are few things more lonely than being in a room with people that are supposed to love you. And he was talking about his family, but I kind of brought up what we were talking about at the beginning, which is loneliness as this subjective perceived distress for the unmet need of belonging. And that's kind of what we're trying to find the antidote here. And then one sliver of that might be social anxiety.
Right.
Because social anxiety leads to this unmet need of belonging, but there are many things that can contribute. So it's almost like we're trying to examine the loneliness epidemic through the lens of one of many different factors and pillars that can affect this.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I agree.
And personally, like when I try to advise people on how to counteract loneliness, like I have a couple of therapy patients that like their prescription has been to like find ways to reach community.
Yeah.
And I try to say like, okay, what do you like to do? And how do we find a way to do that thing around other people?
Right.
So like if you liked soccer, maybe instead of juggling your backyard, try to join a league.
Right.
Or if you like running, go to a run club instead. And so I just kind of try to treat like community as another prescription in their behavioral activation.
Yeah. Well, I feel less lonely after talking to you.
Okay. Thank you.
Are you going to say the outro?
Mr. Dragon feels a little less lonely too.
All right. You just ruined it.
So, yeah, this was a good episode. I enjoyed talking about this. And if you're listening as the audience, I'm curious too. How did you guys feel about it? If we always want to hear what you think, if you have topics that you want us to dive into instead, you can always come and chat with us or just kind of drop us a message at our Human Content Pod family. We're on Instagram and TikTok at Human Content Pods, or you can contact the team directly at howtobepatientpod.com.
And send us a letter. Preston's address
I'll
is.
see it. I'm compulsively when I check these things. Thank you to everyone who's like leaving kind feedback and awesome reviews. If you've subscribed to my Instagram or other Patreon related things, we'll start dropping content there as well. So I know subscribing to Preston's Instagram has been fruitless recently, but stuff is coming, I promise. Also, full videos will be available on our YouTube channel each week at It's Presro. So it's just all through my YouTube and nothing else there. I think that's all the clerical stuff. So now for the fun part,
you can't find me
we're
anywhere.
your hosts, Preston Roche,
Margaret Duncan. Did we say our last name?
and our executive producers are me, Preston Roche, Margaret Duncan, Will Flannery, Kristen Flannery, Aaron Corney, Rob Goldman, and Shanti Brook. Our editor and engineer is Jason Portizo. Our music is by Omer Benzvi. To learn about our program disclaimer, and ethics policies, submission verification, licensing terms, and our HIPAA release terms, go to our website, howtobepatientpod.com, or reach out to us at howtobepatient@human-content.com with any questions or concerns. How to Be Patient is a human content production. Thank you for watching. If you want to see more of us, or if you want to see, this is Lilac, she's my cat. She's going to be waving her hand at one of the floating boxes, which will lead to more episodes. Lilac, point to the other episodes. Lilac doesn't know what the internet is, but I swear they're there. They probably exist for real. But in the meantime, I'm just going to pet Lilac, and then I'm going to go dance in the background.